Past the woods and beyond the sun, a chronicle of interdimensional insurgency and how the sun went out, by Raymond Ankinus. Era 1, The Bridge Between Dimensions. Mavis Green, Scourge of the Mystics. On the woodland road there walked two travelers. The broad brim of the first one's hat covered her face from view, and a rifle hung from one shoulder. Her gun and the wild forest surrounding them starkly contrasted her pristine blue dress. The pigment of its fabric flowed like water around her, and the emerald sewn into its shoulders glowed. She walked steadily forward and offered no greeting to the man walking towards her. He had a heavy deerskin jacket and a soft enough step to reveal his city-dwelling life story. His scowl was learned, and life hadn't put it on his face. They met in the middle of the road, and neither stepped off to the side. "Who trespasses on my land?" asked the woman. "Storm's comin', you know." The man watched her carefully. She calmly held the fore-end of the slung rifle in her hand, and she did not raise her head or show her face. "A simple drifter," he said. "I'm heading to the next town is all. Who are you to call these woods your own?" The wind blew across the road, and the woman held the brim of her hat. Her voice had been human, and the way she walked and moved was too smooth to be an impersonation. Fugitives frequented these roads, but this woman was dressed like nobility. The man kept a calm face on, reserving any conclusions he might have drawn. "You don't get to learn my name yet," she said. "I'm a scavenger of sorts, nothing more than that." She let go of her rifle and gestured out to the woods around them. "These woods are mine because taking this road would be suicide without my presence. So either show a bit of gratitude or step to the side, or give me a reason to protect what is mine." The man studied her. On her hip was a broadsword, and on the arm that held her hat's brim was a scar that stretched from her index finger's tip to her elbow. Her face was like that of a statue, perfectly rounded and regal. Travelers grew dirty and tired over time, but this woman had an otherworldly presence, as though the grime of this world left her untouched. Even the golden chains adorning her snowy white hat were unblemished by the elements. She made no move as they faced one another. He took a deep breath and stepped out of her way. "Good, thank you. I'm tired enough as it is," she said. After passing by, she let go of her hat's brim, and the wind whipped through it. Only the back of her head was visible, and her long golden hair tossed around violently enough to conceal any distinguishing features. "Lady, answer me this. Are you wanted by the law?" he asked. She stopped in her tracks and faced away. The road stretched to the forest's end in either direction. No twists, no bends, just miles' worth of gravel. Not a single human being bore witness to anything that happened here, and in the moment that the woman stopped walking, the man became extremely aware of just how alone he was. "And if I am?" she asked. "Then I must confess I'm no simple drifter. I'm a marshal of the law and a licensed autonomous field officer," he called to her. She turned around and faced him once more. The brim of her hat folded and flapped as the wind blew harder. He held up his badge and slowly moved his other hand down towards the holster on his belt. Whatever bounty was on her head, whatever she'd done, it would all be a waste if he didn't live through this conversation. "Field officers don't belong in the woods, nor should they be harassing young traveling women," she said. He pulled the handgun from its holster as she took a step towards him. The rifle on her shoulder remained there, and she let go of its fore-end. With both hands free, she took another step. The wind continued to pick up. "Take one more step and I'll put a hole in you," he yelled. "Put the gun on the ground and kneel in the road." His service pistol had gotten him out of confrontations like this one before, but the adrenaline running through his veins kept him from holding his sight picture steady. If she was willing to face down an officer, there was no doubt that the bounty on her head was worth fortunes. "You're going to shoot me full of holes?" she asked. "Fine, I'll do as you ask." The woman took one hand and placed it on her head. With the other, she took hold of the rifle and placed it on the ground, all without pointing the weapon in his direction or placing her hand near its controls. Calmly, she did as she was told and knelt down on the gravel road. Droplets of rain fell on the trees above, and the sky began to darken as the storm blew in. "And now what, my dear officer? What would you like to do now that my rifle is getting rained on? Are we going to walk 7 miles to the next town while you slowly lead me with that pistol of yours?" she asked. "Take off your hat and let me see your face," he said. The woman slowly moved her hands down to the brim of her hat. She shuffled around on her knees so that her back was to him, and only then did she remove the hat. Her hair lay down flat despite the wind. "Stand up and look at me," he yelled. Both of his hands wrapped around the pistol's grip, and he leaned into the firearm as he watched her move. The woman rose from her knees and stood there in the rain, arms calmly at her sides. The wind was howling now, and the rain began to hammer the ground, and the hot summer's temperature boiled each drop as it touched the ground. Steam rose as she turned to face him, and the man's hard expression turned to one of horror as he realized his mistake. No face coated her head. In its place was a mask of wood and stone, fused with the woman's skin and bone. She raised her hand and pointed it at him, and he pulled the trigger of his pistol as many times as the magazine allowed. Through the clamor of the storm and the terror in his soul, the man found himself with an empty gun and an untouched adversary. She smiled and picked her personal effects off the ground as the distant roaring of beasts echoed above the thunder and rain. "Run," she said. And so the grand arbiter of justice, the veritable judge, jury, and executioner of so many before, ran for his life down a stormy woodland road with nothing but his life and an empty firearm. The woman in the brimmed hat leaned against a tree as bestial creatures darted through the underbrush. She gave it till the count of 10 and then snapped her fingers. The creatures vanished, and so too did the illusion she'd placed over her face. Mavis Green opened the bolt of her rifle. It was still unloaded. She never loaded it unless she knew her opponent. She eyed her surroundings for a moment while feeling the ammunition in her pockets. No friends of the officer lurked nearby. Mavis closed the action up once more. All of this was just in a day's work, all done in the name of keeping a clean hunting ground. She looked around. Nobody else walked the road, and no creatures stalked her, so she left the gravel and made her way into the thick of the forest. A little bit of rain felt nice, especially with how hot the season had been. While she walked, the rest of her illusions slowly fell away. The ethereal dress she wore was replaced by a simple pair of pants and a skirt and a shirt. Her hair receded back to its true length, and the witch's perfectly unblemished skin turned back to that of a human being. The sword on her hip remained as it was, though its sheath changed from gold inlaid metal to simple leather. Best to dress down for the occasion she was preparing for. There was a town meeting tonight, and Mavis intended to be there. Matters that concerned her were slowly populating the list of issues that the townsfolk were whispering, talking and shouting about. To them, she was just Mavis Green, the local vagrant. She was just a woman living in the shadow of her mother's glory. She made her way through the rainy woods. Water poured from the leaves as it funneled down through the branches of great old trees, and the underbrush jumped and flapped with every impact of the raindrops. There were no trails or walkways through these woods. Only the gravel road managed to carve a path through its terrain. She preferred to trek through nature itself, though, and the woods respected her all the more for it. Deep in the forest was her camp. She dug a small fire pit, set up a shelter of branches and leaves in the miniature clearing, and had a modest stash of food and belongings in the 2 wooden boxes set up beside her shelter. Home, sweet home, she thought. There was still time to make the trek down. There was still time to make the trek to town. And so she sat down and made herself a meal of berries, fruits, and mushrooms. Spilling blood was risky business out in these woods. Otherwise, she'd have gotten herself a rabbit or deer. Mavis took another bite of her food as the rain continued to fall on her. The whole forest was filled with steam as the drops vaporized upon impact, and visibility was poor. Despite that, she could just make out a number of silhouettes wandering the woods. Once upon a time, she'd been unable to see them. They had been nothing but myths and stories to her, as they were to everyone else. Things are different now, she thought. She whistled, and one of the silhouettes lifted its head. It was a chimera with the head of a deer and the body of a human. She smiled at him, unafraid, as he wandered into her camp. Years ago, her mother had passed this gift on to her, and someday she would find an heir to pass it down to as well. Hey, she said. I'm Mavis. The creature stared for a moment and then sat down beside her. You are light, he said. The voice that came from him was like static. It ran up and down the full scale of pitch with each syllable. I'm still alive, yes. Not a silhouette yet, she said. Tell me about yourself. He looked down. I lost my tribe, said the chimera. We were traveling to our homeland when the Formorians rose up from the dirt. No Formorians had been in this part of the universe for a few thousand years, nor had chimeras. Mavis took another bite of her food and studied the creature. And what happened then, she asked. The silhouettes in the distance drifted around the campsite as she and the chimera chatted. None of them could see past the haze in their vision. Dimensional blindness put a real damper on a person's afterlife. Spears were raised, shields were broken. My last memory is one of teeth and red, he said. Dire wolf Fomorians, then. The sort that dwarf the bears of the modern world. Mavis shivered as she contemplated the scale of those ancient battles. Another conflict like the Fomorian incursions would have ended life on this planet. She ate a few more berries from her bowl. Tragic, she replied. I can tell you gave everything for them. Be at peace. Go rest your soul before you turn to wandering. Mavis reached out and touched him, and he stood from where he sat. The chimera's silhouette walked out into the distance and fizzled into a haze as he made his way into steam of the summertime storm. No more would his soul go astray. This was a good batch of berries, she thought as she took another bite. None of the other silhouettes noticed her throughout the exchange with the chimera. Many never saw her unless she deliberately sought their attention. For others, what barred them was the fear of approaching a shepherd such as herself, since many of the shepherds had been corrupted by the power they held. Keeping track of the fallen was one of the duties for which she was responsible. She looked down at her bowl, where hardly anything remained. Mavis lifted it to her mouth and washed it down with the rainwater that had pooled in the bowl while she ate. The storm showed no sign of slowing, and Mavis had a trek ahead of her. She pulled the makeshift door away from the front of her shelter and knelt down at the entrance. Her backpack and walking stick lay on the ground beside her bedspread. It was still surprisingly dry inside. She took her backpack and walking stick and then closed the entrance tightly. I'd really rather not sleep on a soggy spread, she thought. The silhouettes wandered around her as she made her way towards town. She kept her hat on, and rain washed down the brim like a fountain. Even the wolves stayed out of the storm, since the weather for hunting would be much less hostile tomorrow. Rain was not a trivial event here. There were things that thrived off of it, and things that dared not show their face while it poured. Halfway to town, she came to the ruins. Trees grew through destroyed, decaying cabins. Roads were covered by thickets and ferns, and gardens had long since been taken over by the natural flora. She stood at the outskirts and took her rifle from its sling. The old surplus Mauser was still unloaded, and she used her offhand to shield its exposed action from the rain. Most of the danger in this place came from the feral wanderers that had decided to take shelter in this decaying corpse of human civilization. She loaded 5 lead-bulleted rounds into the rifle by hand, then closed the action and advanced toward the ruins. Distant bumps and crashes came from inside the houses, and Mavis kept her stance low and her steps quiet. No need to cause a stir. "I'm just passing through," she said silently. Even though many of the windows were boarded up, she stood close to the houses and ducked beneath any holes in the walls. Incoherent yelling from within the next building she passed was audible over the storm, and she held onto her rifle even tighter. 2 ruins left to pass, and after that she'd be free to roam the forest once more. Up ahead she could see a figure digging in front of an old home. Someone rich lived there once, but all that remained of the building was an architectural skeleton of stone and wood. Wanderers lived there now, not a penny to their name. The morning wanderer slammed its shovel into the ground jerkily. Its movements looked almost sickly, and she rapped her finger over the trigger guard as she moved forwards. No noise, no fighting, she told herself. Be a mouse for as long as you can fake it. The creature continued to dig as she stalked through the underbrush. Mavis took a wide route around it, and from behind it she could see the keratin spikes growing from its body. Propped up against the decaying barn was another wanderer, dead and unblinking as rain poured down onto it and into its eyes. Nearby others wept and wallowed in the mud. It was quite the funeral, but Mavis couldn't stop to pay her respects. Perhaps the wanderers hadn't completely lost the memories they had of life before death, or of having a soul without cracks. She continued on towards the forest path. The forest passed packs of wanderers. Many had the hardened tumors that came with a broken soul. Life after death was unkind here on earth, and those who found themselves trapped in it were doomed to grow a shell of hardened keratin that would eventually encase them. One to her left had almost his whole arm immobilized by the malignant growths, and another sat pitifully on the stoop of a dilapidated structure, his eyes covered by the tumor. Had the occasion been less tragic and the weather more accommodating, she'd have put him out of his misery. But today wasn't a day to hunt. Mavis had somewhere to be. She was thankful as she came to the end of the ruins, because the final building seemed to be empty. Mavis was able to make her way past it without issue. From there she bolted off into the woods with her rifle in hand. Had her heart started beating any louder, she would have worried that they could hear it. Though the eyesight of the wanderers was blurred and hazy at best, their sense of hearing and smell were both keen. Town was just a few miles out. She took a deep breath, slung the rifle back over her shoulder, and continued on towards the light. Even her hat was getting soggy at this point, and a chance to sit inside for a while was a welcome one. Mavis made it to town just as the locals began trickling into the meeting house. Lanterns flickered from amidst the crowd, and Mavis merged with the flow of townsfolk on their way to the doors of the house. Few people looked in her direction, and fewer still acknowledged her. The town watchmen were letting people in one by one. A bunch of boys with billy clubs was the extent of those watchmen's law enforcement qualifications, and a watchman's ability to swing the club was the extent of his authority. Speaking of which, she looked around. There was no sign of her friend from the forest. At the back of the dwindling crowd, a woman began to yell, and Mavis looked over at her. Mrs. Middlestrom had every right to yell, but of course the watchmen had no concept of grief, nor did the town administration. They kept an eye on her, and the other townsfolk each spared her a glance of disdain before moving on with their evening. "Let me in! That's my child you're after! Let me speak!" the woman cried again and again. A member of the town watch walked over and confronted her. Mavis leaned against the wall and watched. The town watch meatheads weren't the ones she wanted to reason with. Even their chief wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. She caught a snippet of the watchman's rebuttal to the furious woman. Either you keep your mouth shut and leave, or I drag you home and stand guard until the meeting is over. Masters of diplomacy, thought Mavis. The crowd had mostly made its way inside, and so she walked past the front door's guards and took a seat in the back row of chairs in the meeting house. It was dry enough in here, so she set her hat down on the seat beside her. Usually only 20 or 30 people came for these meetings, but recent events had the town on edge, and tonight there were easily over 80 packed into the small space. The gavel hit its plate. Everyone turned and faced the front of the room where Mayor Braun, Watchmaster Pluto, and other town officials sat. Braun and some committee member leaned towards each other, whispering quickly, and then the meeting was called to order. As you are all sharply aware, this gathering was called very much on short notice. Unfortunately for a peaceful town, there has been an incident that must be addressed immediately. Last night at around 1 a.m, our own Joey Middlestrom was taken from his house. Chief Pluto may explain the investigation in a moment, but it is our understanding that the perpetrator is not so human as we might have wished, he announced. Mavis chewed on her lip. If she'd learned anything throughout her unique life circumstances, it was that people didn't react well to the things Mr. Pluto was about to unveil to the crowd. She kept her arms crossed, with one resting gently on the grip of her sword, just in case. Chief Pluto stood as the mayor sat down. 1 a.m, Mrs. Middlestrom awoke to the sound of glass breaking. She grabbed the fire iron, rushed to her boy's room, and found it empty. But in the wall of the boy's bedroom was a jagged hole. By 1:30, my men and I responded to the scene. The hole in the wall was coated with pure white ice, and judging by the images reflected by it as we stared, I could only conclude that there is a lich wandering these woods. A dead man, brought back by rituals bent on consuming souls to fuel his immortality. He stopped speaking and cleared his throat as the room fell completely silent. Whispers began amidst the townfolk as the initial shock of the statement wore off, and the whispers then rose to talk. We don't speak of the spirits, said Mrs. Larson, owner of the local apothecary. She very much spoke of the spirits, but only the friendly ones. Mavis thought back to her own encounter with a tortured soul. There is a spiritual plane of existence for a reason. Because they don't belong here, she thought. And who's to say it wasn't a simple magical practitioner, asked the blacksmith. There have been some strange folk in this town before. The chief raised his hand's palm facing the crowds in an attempt to silence them. Several people stood up in protest, and Mavis did what she did best. Be a mouse. No need to get into a glorified bar fight. She liked her teeth, and she certainly didn't want to lose enough of them that she would look like the town's general populace. And you paid those strange folk to make those swords and earned you some coin, accused another woman. The blacksmith turned to face her, and the two of them stared furiously at one another. If I may, the chief interjected. The woman turned to him. And your watch hasn't done a thing about the livestock we've lost over the past few weeks. Not a single guard was posted on my fields after 10 of my sheep were killed. Ma'am, I assure you, the door slammed open, and a soaking wet federal marshal stalked into the meeting hall. He had his pistol in hand and a crazed look in his eyes. Any sadistic entertainment value that Mavis had seen in this meeting was washed away at the sight of him. Something else had happened to him on that road. There was no way her old forest spirit act had caused that look of insanity in his face. You backwater cultists owe me an explanation for that thing in the woods, he shouted. Give me one reason not to burn this accursed place to the ground, or I swear I'll come back with a division of cavalry to hunt down and trample each and every one of you. He staggered forward toward the front of the room. Mavis placed her hat beneath her seat and calmly took the rifle from where she leaned it against the wall. The marshal stood at the center of the room, staring at the mayor and the chief. I beg your pardon, sir, but could you please explain what happened out in the woods? Asked Pluto. The watchmen at the back of the room gripped their clubs tighter. Usually, Mavis would have bet on the federal officer in a matchup of clubs versus handgun, but the man was unhinged. But the man was unhinged enough that she wasn't sure whether the watchman or the onlookers would get a bullet if he decided to open fire. The woman with the mask sent mutated husks to follow me. She told me to run, and so I did. Not a mile down this road, I was surrounded by flayed husks, and only by every round left in my handgun was I able to make it here alive. Now explain to me and think very carefully about what you say. Why shouldn't I enact my right as a marshal and decapitate the leadership of this clearly infected town? He said. The handgun was loaded, despite his description of his encounter on the road. Apparently you're still coherent enough to reload, she thought. It would have made things a whole lot easier if he'd expended all of his shots before he got to town. As it stood, Mavis kept the rifle propped on her lap, ready in case things got messy. Chief Pluto gestured to the officer and looked around at the townfolk. Those who had stood up to argue sat down in their seats once more. The blacksmith and the other woman cast their eyes down at the floor. Mrs. Larson scowled, and the officer raised his hands in protest. Well, he demanded. As you can see, Marshal, said Chief Pluto, we are here to discuss a solution to the exact issue you've described. Until last night, not one of us was aware of this creature's presence in our peaceful village. Now, since you're here and you're clearly familiar with such situations, I'd like to extend an invitation to you. We can use each and every man and woman capable of conducting police work. He extended his hand towards the marshal from his place at the front of the meeting room, and the marshal made his way down the aisle. The faux dignity he put on would have been comedic had circumstances been different. Mavis wasn't laughing tonight. For all the chief's ideas of killing a lich, she did not think he quite understood the gravity of the situation. Even so, the townsfolk clapped as the federal marshal took his badge in his palm, and then shook hands with Chief Pluto. Men and women of considerate, we are in good hands, said the chief, and so the meeting went on. Mavis didn't pay as much attention to the rest. It mostly consisted of back-and-forth rambling about previous crimes in town, murders and how they dealt with them, and what to do about Mrs. Middlestrom's inevitable hysteria after her child was slaughtered by the inevitably gross mismanagement of the situation. By considerate standards, it was a fairly productive meeting, and at around 10 o'clock, people were shuffling out of the meeting hall. As she watched the townfolk filing out, Mavis noted that at least the rain had finally stopped. Once the last attendees had exited the meeting hall, Mavis made her way up to the front of the room. Chief Pluto and Mayor Braun still sat there, discussing the situation with the marshal and a number of senior watchmen, who Mavis knew to be more than sticks of order-taking meat that could wield a club. The two town officials eyed her as she entered the circle, and neither looked happy to see her. Mavis, I was hoping we wouldn't have to do this tonight, said Braun. The man was a fat aristocrat at heart. He had come into power years ago, when his father handed down his signet ring and passed away. Nothing but the dynasty qualified him to be the town's mayor. But who was she to judge? Some uppity forest rat had no place before this king of his corner of earth. Braun, Pluto, I respectfully ask to be a part of this investigation. You know I'm invaluable here, she said. The incident with the Dryad a few years ago was enough of an example to draw on. What a mess that had been. Even now, Mavis couldn't get the image of that thing's face out of her mind. It's like I tell you each and every time, Mavis, this was your mother's field, not yours, said Pluto, and she clearly wasn't all that good at it. He had a stack of papers in front of him. Incident reports, crime scene findings, etc. The chief of watch hardly gave her the courtesy of looking her in the eye when he spoke. Call it a family business, then, said Mavis. Either you take me onto your crew or I start my own private investigation. There was no risk in being blunt with these people. The only language they responded to was complete and utter literality. The marshal eyed her as she stood there. Mavis was at no risk of being recognized by him. Her woman of the woods persona looked nothing like her true form. A proper forest spirit didn't have muscles tempered by years of woodcraft and swordsmanship, nor would it have had her long brown hair. Her hat had been the only structurally unchanged part of her, and even that had been cloaked in illusions. "Good luck to you, then, Green," said Braun idly. "Run along, there are matters to be discussed that don't concern you." He waved her away, and Mavis smiled warmly. These people were going to get Joey Middlestrom killed, at best, and at worst they'd get the town invaded by the federal military or a horde of wanderers. She buttoned up her coat as she stood there in front of them. Run along, she thought. At least I'm light enough to run without losing consciousness. Talk about my mother again, and I'll take your tongue as a souvenir, she replied. Her tone stayed level, and her smile stayed on her face. Before Pluto could react, she turned and walked down the central aisle of the meeting house, only stopping to retrieve her hat from beneath her seat. There was nothing left to discuss here. If Pluto wanted to stick his watchman on her, so be it. "It's a thankless job, Mavis," her mother told her one night. "They're going to give me all the praise in the world once I've died. But not while I'm alive. Never while I'm alive." The great Ezra Green had spent her life sealing away the ancient evil known only as the Devourer, and yet it was never enough. "Heal our sick," they'd plead. "Tell us our future," they'd badger her. Mavis remembered her mother taking it all in stride. "Smile and walk. Tell him to choke in the sweetest voice you can muster." Mavis never forgot that lesson. All the false reverence she witnessed at her mother's funeral was the nail in the coffin for her. "I'll defend you with my life, considerant," she thought, "but I'll never belong here. No town deserves to be destroyed by evils of the land beyond the sun." Thankfully, the storm had passed them by. She had a 10-minute walk to Mrs. Middlestrom's house. Best to start at the scene of the crime itself, she figured. Mavis sighed and put on her hat. She could already tell that sleep was out of the question tonight. Mama would be proud, she thought. She always told me to do the right thing. And with that, Mavis Green headed towards the house of grieving mother. And that's the end of part 1. It's not the end of Mavis Green by a long shot, but I'll continue that in the next recording.